Hello and welcome to the Neurologic podcast, coming to you from the UT Dallas Center for Vital Longevity, which is dedicated to pursuing research that leads to cognitive health for life. Our goal is to educate you on the latest matters relating to cognition and the brain, and with each episode we will be interviewing leading scientists and sharing their insights and suggestions to promote cognitive health throughout the lifespan. My name is Amber Kidwai.
And my name is Sarah Munir.
And this is Neurologic. Welcome back to the show. In this episode, we're diving into the science of aging and cognition with Dr. Yaakov Stern, a researcher in cognitive neuroscience and professor of neuropsychology at Columbia University.
Dr. Stern is the first recipient of the Denise C. Research Excellence Award in honor of his seminal work in cognitive aging, which he received last month during the 15th anniversary celebration of the Center for Vital Longevity.
If you've ever wondered why some people stay sharp well into old age while others struggle, this episode is for you.
Dr. Stern is best known for introducing the concept of cognitive reserve, the idea that the brain can remain resilient even in the face of damage or disease.
We'll talk about how he came up with that concept, what it means for everyday life, and how factors like education, social engagement, and even bilingualism can help protect your brain.
We'll also explore how Alzheimer's research has evolved, what new tools like brain scans and blood biomarkers are telling us, and what you can start doing today to support a healthy brain as you age.
So let's jump in. Okay, so before we begin talking about your research, could you share a bit about your background and how you got interested in studying cognition and aging in particular?
Okay, when I was in college, I majored in psychology, but I really had no direction. I took a year off and worked, and then I went to the New School, which is a master's program for a while. And then I was visiting my now wife, and I were visiting my brother-in-law, who was down at City College. They had this nice building downtown, and he was studying philosophy. And my fiancée said to me, "You know, they probably have some really nice psychology programs here. Why don't you go up?" So I went up to the psychology office, and there was this just one program that was still open. It was called experimental cognition. Looked good, so I applied. First of all, it turns out that it's up at City College. It's in the north part of Manhattan. But they interviewed me and they said, are you interested in animal research? I said, well, I know how they're teaching chimpanzees to speak. That sounds really cool. They said, no, we're talking about rats. And after a while, they said to me, you clearly have no idea of what we do in this program. We do some rat research and we do something called neuropsychology, which I never heard of. So I just fell into it. I fell into neuropsychology. I don't know if you've heard of Steve Mattis. He's quite a well-known neuropsychologist. He came and taught a class, and then you could see patients after a while with him. And then the other good stroke of luck is that the second year I was there, they brought in this guy, Jeff Rosen from Boston, to work with the people who are interested in neuropsychology. And he said to me, there's this guy from Columbia who got he finished his residence and he went to Boston. Boston then was the center of behavioral neurology. And my student worked with him, and now he's just come back as a new assistant professor at Columbia. Why don't you go up and talk with him and see if you can work something out? So I just started working with him. We started working on Parkinson's disease and cognition and other stuff, and I've just been there ever since. So it's just funny how these things can happen. I just sort of fell into it.
Yeah.
So your research now focuses on how cognition changes in normal aging and also on diseases of aging like Alzheimer's disease. So how has our understanding of Alzheimer's changed since you first started working in the field?
Well, when I started working in the field, Alzheimer's disease was considered a rare disease. And that's because what Alzheimer's described was really the inherited form of Alzheimer's disease in young people. And older people who had these problems, they called it something else. They didn't call it Alzheimer's disease. And then you probably know this, but the listeners don't. There was a very famous article by Katzman and Terry where they said, wait a second, we're following older people over time. And the people that have dementia, when we look in their brains, they have the same plaques that Alzheimer's described. So this is really a very prevalent disease. So I got caught up in the Alzheimer's field. At that point, the government started pushing a lot of research towards Alzheimer's. They started Alzheimer's centers and the like. I think people are pretty confident that they could cure it quickly because they had just done L-DOPA for Parkinson's disease, and they felt they could find something like that. But obviously, that hasn't happened. And our understanding of the disease has really changed dramatically. I mean, we knew that there were plaques and tangles, but beyond that, the level of understanding of the disease at this point is really very different.
Yeah, I think back then, prior to that, they just thought old people will inevitably have some kind of senility.
They called it senility. Yeah. My grandfather had it, and my father told me, he had senility, and the doctor told me they would be able to cure it soon.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of the recent advances in the field of Alzheimer's disease with like the imaging definitely helped us better define and understand the disease.
Right. So all forms of imaging, first we could just image the brain. Mm-hmm. It's the structure of the brain, and then we could image function. Eventually we could image the amyloid and the tau actually in the brain. That was a major advance. And of course now we can just take a blood sample. It doesn't help us locate, but we know who has amyloid and tau. So those things have changed a lot, and just our knowledge about the disease and how it develops has really blossomed. The basic science has really exploded. So I feel more hopeful now than I did before, although I still think we're not there in treating the disease.
So a long way to go.
Yeah, but I think the idea that you can now get a blood test that can give you some idea, that there's some blood-based biomarkers there is really exciting because it just makes it so much more accessible.
It's very helpful. I just read a very interesting article about that where they were cautioning that we have to be very careful about what that means. Let's say you have someone who's cognitively normal and has that blood test. What can we really do with that? Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, it's inexpensive and it can really help with diagnosis in the proper hands.
Mm-hmm. But also just having measures that you can use to study what people are exposed to and how that affects the cognition. And
definitely.
Also how it maybe changes over time. Like if you follow them, is there amyloid, for example, increasing, and what are we seeing there?
Right. That's a whole line of research that I've been involved in that most people don't know as much about, is just the natural history of Alzheimer's disease and the heterogeneity of the progression. Some people have, the problems with memory everyone recognizes, but some people have problems with mood. Mm-hmm. Some people have extrapyramidal signs, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. There's a whole heterogeneity of the presentation of the disease, which is probably related to heterogeneity in the underlying pathology.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah. Makes sense. So one of the things that you're most known for is for introducing the concept of cognitive reserve. So what exactly is cognitive reserve?
Cognitive reserve. It's a concept. The basic idea is very straightforward. The idea of cognitive reserve is two people can have the same amount of brain change. In normal aging, we might talk about brain measures like the thickness of the skull of the brain, or white matter hyperintensities. In Alzheimer's disease, we could talk about amyloid or tau or other pathologies. So two people can have the same amount of those pathologies, and one person can be better cognitively than the other. In other words, some people can cope with the pathology better than others. So we called that cognitive reserve. The reason I called it cognitive reserve is there was already this concept of brain reserve that Katzman had put forward.
So what is brain reserve?
Brain reserve is a little different. It's that someone can cope with the Alzheimer's pathology, let's say, because they have more brain to lose. They don't have as much brain change, so the greater amount of brain allows them to do better in the face of the pathology. So the brain reserve is more a structural kind of a concept. Now the better concept, I guess, longitudinally is called brain maintenance. Some people can maintain their brains over time better than others, but that's just talking about the structural changes or not getting pathology, whereas cognitive reserve is about coping with the pathology, dealing with the pathology.
So this brain reserve, it was based on Katzman's paper where he actually followed or saw 10 women's brains during autopsy who had pathology, but they were cognitively normal when they passed.
Right.
So that's kind of how that term came about.
That's how that term came about, and that's where cognitive reserve came out, because he called it brain reserve. But yeah, I was very interested in that. But we had early evidence that two people could have the same amount of pathology, and one person could be more demented than the other, have more severe dementia. So that's so somehow people were coping with it better. So that's how the cognitive reserve side of it. But we called it cognitive reserve because there was brain reserve. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because, intuitively you think that things like Alzheimer's disease, it's basically a function of the plaques and tangles, or aging is a function of, the brain changes that are happening, but it seems like it's not always this 1-to-1 ratio going on.
That's correct. There's a lot more going on. And when I started, we looked at variables like education or occupation. But now we can look at all kinds of life exposures, but now we're at the point where we can study it using imaging, and people are studying it using even more advanced kinds of chemical measures, like omics is the new word that's used for all kinds of measures. So it opens up a whole other way of thinking about how some people cope with the disease better than others.
So is it right to say that cognitive reserve is some kind of property of the brain? We're not really defining what property, or I'm sure there are multiple properties. We don't know which one it is.
It's perfect that you say that, because over the last few years, I ran a program to come up with sort of consensus definitions for these concepts that we're talking about, because the National Institute on Aging had a meeting about cognitive reserve, and everybody was using different words and sort of talking past one another. So they asked for a collaboratory, I didn't make up that word, to have a whole set of meetings. We ended up having 4 meetings, and we actually published working definitions for Alzheimer's disease. And it was people who work with, researchers who work with people, but also researchers who work with animals. And when we sat down, me and my committee, the very first day, the very first thing we said, let's try to define, and we said cognitive reserve is a property of the brain.
Yeah.
So it's not, I think about it because I'm a neuropsychologist about education or differential activation of networks, but one can talk about it on the genetic level or many other levels as well.
So basically, it's something that moderates the impact of changes in somebody's brain. Somebody who has more cognitive reserve would be able to tolerate those changes.
So that's the working definition, is that it moderates the impact of brain change on cognitive change. And because moderation is a very specific term, specifying a very specific analysis, we said even if you can't get a full moderation, if it can account for better than expected performance, that would be cognitive reserve also, even if it doesn't moderate statistically.
What exactly is brain maintenance then? How does that relate to brain reserve and cognitive reserve?
So brain maintenance is actually a concept that came up later. Now it's a while, but it was the most recent concept that came out. It was from a group that was mainly working with cognitive aging. So there's all these changes that happen to the brain as we age. The white matter changes, the thickness of the outside of the brain changes, many, many different changes. Some people show less of those changes than others. They're maintaining their brain. And just that simple maintaining of the brain allows some people to do better cognitively than others. And it's interesting because a lot of the same exposures that seem to be associated with cognitive reserve are also associated with brain maintenance, but they don't correlate with one another, brain maintenance and cognitive reserve. They're two separate concepts, both very important.
So brain maintenance is kind of how much you're able to maintain the structure of your brain, to hold on to what you have, basically.
Correct.
But then how is that different from brain reserve?
Well, brain reserve was a cross-sectional concept.
Okay.
It was when
So
Katzman
people
and
who
Terry,
have bigger brains would do better, kind of thing.
they have brain reserve. So
Yeah.
that was, but brain maintenance, I think, is nice because it's a longitudinal.
Yeah. So it's a person holding on to what they have and not losing,
Correct.
not having atrophy. as
Yeah,
much
but
atrophy.
they're very closely related.
Yeah.
But brain reserve was there first.
Yeah.
That was sort of the first concept that made me think about the whole thing.
Yeah. So are there certain lifestyle factors that allow us to maintain our cognition or allow us to build cognitive reserve?
Yes. That's a whole interesting area of research. And the first things that we looked at, just because they were easy, were education or occupation. But it turns out that there's a whole set of exposures or experiences from early childhood to late adulthood that seem to be associated with cognitive reserve and with brain maintenance, but specifically with cognitive reserve, starting with the socioeconomic status of the family, the kind of exposure kids have to words and play, the quality of schools people go to, the quality of education, the jobs people have and what kind of demands those jobs have. And then as we get later in life, once people get older, and let's say they're retiring, it's, do they have social networks? Do they stay cognitively engaged? Do they exercise? So there's a whole set of exposures that are associated with cognitive reserve. And it's important to think about it that each one really does something unique, right? So a lot of people, when they do research on this, they'll have a cognitive reserve questionnaire, and then they'll try to create a summary score. So it might somehow tell us who has more reserve than others, but really what we have to do is take into account every single exposure separately, because each one does its own thing.
Well, I'm sure there's also a lot of interrelationship between these factors as well, right? So maybe somebody from a low socioeconomic background, they're not going to pursue education as much as somebody coming from a high. So I assume, there's probably some difficulties in separating out the direct influences of all of these.
Right. I mean, what's fun to see is that whatever concept you get interested in, you can go extremely deep in that area. So let's just talk about occupation. So we can talk about a high or low level of occupation, or now we have ways where occupations are described by 60, 70 different definitions or descriptions of what that occupation requires. So if you're interested in occupation, you can really go very, very deeply into it at a level. And every single one of these exposures is the same. And you're right. I mean, it is more likely someone from a high SES family might be more likely to have the parents read to them or go to a better school. So they are intertwined as well.
I mean, I feel like they could all kind of be distilled down into SES, right? Because even the higher occupations, would you not have had a better education to begin with, more likely to get you into those better occupations?
But you can separate them. I mean, you can do those analyses and show that each one shows something unique.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. And does higher education have to do with people with higher education go on to have better jobs and live in healthier neighborhoods and probably have more, like a social circle that's healthy?
It all works that way, but even higher education, take just that. So I have a PhD in neuropsychology. My colleague, Chris Habeck, has a PhD in particle physics, right? So we both have a PhD, but it's two very different kinds of exposures, right? So every one of them, you're right that you're more likely to get some of that. But still, you have people from high SES who don't end up with good jobs, and they are related, but you can really separate out exposures and influences as well.
So are we able to actually look at causation there? Like, do we know that people who seek out higher education are maybe those people who are more likely to have more cognitive reserve in the first place because of the way they kind of approach things? Or is it that the education is building the cognitive reserve?
These are very good questions. These are very good questions. And I think what's interesting is that, for example, we looked at education as our very first cognitive reserve measure. I think because Katzman had been using it. But it turns out, and in our hands, we were able to show in North Manhattan, which is a very diverse population, that education was associated with differential cognitive change, even not Alzheimer's, but just age-related cognition. But the people who study age-related cognition, on the whole, have not shown education as a moderator, as a measure of cognitive reserve, whereas other things like occupation or IQ are. Whereas in Alzheimer's disease, education is definitely. So they each act a little differently, and have, and you know, what we have to do is, I think everybody who does research sort of picks what they're interested in and what they can focus on. So you can't do it all. So you have to sort of settle for certain sets of definitions and work with those to look at the things you're really interested in.
Yeah. Another kind of evolution we've been seeing a lot with, studying aging and cognitive neuroscience is really trying to go more and more back in time to early childhood experiences and how this affects how, our aging process. Now we're even, there's a lot of discussions now on maternal health and the factors that can affect the baby development. So it's really interesting to see that aging research is now really trying to push back to what's happening in childhood.
100%. It's in my research, I start with people 20 and older, because the younger years are very complicated, and things sort of go backwards in the younger years in terms of exposures. And but that is exactly true, that it's a lifelong process. And I think where it ends up is that the cumulative impact of all of these different exposures lend reserve. But I think the kind of thing that I'm thinking about now is that depending on the cognitive process that we're talking about, there might even be unique exposures that are more associated with cognitive reserve towards this cognitive process or that cognitive process.
It's kind of like a multifactorial kind of approach.
Yeah. So let's say like we have several tasks that we give, just to tell you why we're using imaging. Once I was convinced epidemiologically that there was this concept was convincing to me of cognitive reserve, I wanted to understand, well, how is it implemented in the brain? That was just when all of this brain imaging was starting. So now we can, and now we have techniques where we can give people tasks in the scanner and actually see the areas of the brain or the networks that are involved in doing that task. So I got very involved in trying to look at that and understand reserve on that level. So we have different tasks. So we have one task that just gets harder and harder and harder. People have to remember either one letter or 3 letters or 6 letters. And the simple idea of why I like that task is it looks at an increase in difficulty, and one could say, well, maybe reserve is people who don't have to increase the usage of their brain as much, right? They have greater capacity, let's say. No, that's what I
more
call
efficient.
It. Greater efficiency. That's what I called that. And then we have another test that goes really very hard, and we can look for greater capacity. These are very simple concepts, but just to bring them down to a way to get at the neural implementation of cognitive reserve.
To kind of more directly measure it, basically, is what you're saying.
Yeah. So where we're at now is there's distinct networks that we can pick up either using task-related imaging, or there's a thing called resting bold for listeners who are not familiar. It's a way of looking at the brain and how the brain is intertwined and acts even when you're not doing anything. But there's a lot of interesting measures you can get just looking at someone just at rest. And we can find specific measures that moderate in the same way that education or occupation do.
Yeah.
So someone who does better on this task, shows less activation, let's say, on this task, does better in the face of Alzheimer's pathology.
Okay.
Yeah.
So now we have these kind of like physical proxies of reserve, whereas, like education, those are more of these lifestyle proxies.
Right.
But now we can more directly measure what's happening.
Well, like, how's it really implemented in the brain?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then there are people, so like someone at Columbia using our data is looking at energetics, brain energetics, and looking at that in the context of cognitive reserve. So that becomes a much more complex level, because the whole energetic system of the brain is really complex, but it plays a role as well.
Is that to do with like glucose metabolism, or?
No, this is more mitochondria.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, so as we get older, our mitochondria are not as effective. The mitochondria are what involved in the energy of the brain. And there's actually this something that the mitochondria send out that's sort of like a signal to the body. So like you guys listening to this can't see it, but I have gray hair. What happens as you get older is the body decides that we can't, with the mitochondria really, we can't spend energy to keep the hair black. We're going to let it go white. So there's a whole crazy system going on, and that's involved with cognitive reserve as well.
We know that cognitive changes are a part of normal aging. We see decreases in cognitive processes like memory, processing speed, in reasoning and problem-solving abilities, but it's not all decline. There are things like vocabulary and general world knowledge that improve with age.
Right, so that's a very, very interesting, and wisdom.
And wisdom, yeah.
Speaking as an older person.
Yes.
Yeah, so there are things. So I think that's a really interesting question and is studyable. There was someone in my group who put some effort into looking at that. So she was able to show that some of the networks involved in vocabulary are more tight-knit and closer together, let's say, than networks for other abilities. So it could be that there are really differences in the underlying brain networks that are associated with these functions. But yeah, there's certain aspects of information that we acquire with age. The wisdom thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I see it with my postdocs, let's say, where they're actually doing analyses, imaging analyses that are very, very complex, and I've never done them, but I'm very good at understanding how to answer questions of reviewers on a paper, because I've done it so many times.
Right.
So there's things that we learn over time. So there is some wisdom there in old age. We can't expect every older person to be wise.
Yeah.
But, yeah, there are things that change. But I think that some of that is really studyable also at the brain level too. And I haven't seen a lot of work on that.
Yeah, because I think most people look at their cognitive function as their first sign of whether they're healthy or not. They don't tend to go looking for pathology or doing blood tests, just in the sense of how you might do an annual physical for your body.
Yeah.
People don't really
Right.
do that for their brain. They kind of look at the cognitive side
Well,
of it first.
theoretically, when you see, like I see a doctor annually, they're supposed to ask about your cognition,
Yeah.
but they don't have time. There's so many other things to do.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to really measure it in a small visit.
Yeah.
So I think what happens is, unless someone is really having a real problem, it's not really looked at.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then relating it back to cognitive reserve, if somebody's having a real problem but they have high levels of cognitive reserve, does that mean they would be much later along in their pathology, and then less?
Yes.
They'd have kind of less time, I guess, than
So
somebody who's.
that's something I have a paper about that very early on, where we looked at people with Alzheimer's disease and we looked at rates of cognitive decline. And if you control for, at baseline, for the level of cognition people have in people with Alzheimer's disease, the people with higher education actually were declining more rapidly.
Oh, wow.
And what we think is happening there is there's a threshold. The threshold for when the pathologies begins to impact cognition is later. Mm-hmm. But clearly, you can't win, no matter how brilliant you are. If the pathology is bad enough, it's going to impact these brain networks and impact your function. So at that point, you decline more rapidly. But I think it's sort of a good deal. Basically, you have a faster decline, but for a smaller period of time. It's called compression of morbidity. But yeah, and that's something we're more interested in general now also is, okay, we have these exposures that are associated with cognitive reserve. We have certain differential expression of brain networks that are involved with cognitive reserve. But what we're also looking at now is how those cognitive reserve networks, I'm putting my fingers up with what do you call those? Asterisks. Quoting. How they are impacted by brain change. And that happens. That has to happen. Cognition is influenced by brain change, and cognitive reserve networks will be influenced as well. And we have one or two papers like that where we show that directly. But it's nice to show it, but it just makes sense that that's the case. The truth is that normal aging is one thing, but a disease like Alzheimer's disease or dementing illness, if you get it early enough and it's bad enough, the cognitive reserve is going to sort of help you put it off for a while, maybe deal with it a little better, but it's a bad disease. And that's why we really have to cure the disease also. It's not the whole answer.
Right. So how does this affect when and how to diagnose Alzheimer's, and as well as who gets treatment and how quickly they might decline? Yeah.
I mean, it's a complex problem. I think, the cognitive reserve concept is a very hopeful concept. It took a long time now. I think it's an accepted concept now. Use it or lose it. I talk to people about it, lay people. When I first started talking about it, I would go to a meeting, do a poster. For people who don't know, if you don't give a talk at a meeting, you can stand by a poster and people can buy and look at it. And people are coming over to me saying, "Are you crazy? This is Alzheimer's disease." Once the real question now is, when do you diagnose? How do you diagnose? And it's getting very complicated now. We have the beginnings of treatment. It's really the very, very beginnings of treatment. So it's certainly important to diagnose, and maybe to diagnose early, because we'll see how these treatments work. But maybe if you diagnose early, maybe you can keep people going a little bit longer. Although it's still not a full cure. On the other hand, I just read a very interesting article about about these blood biomarkers, and really questioning exactly what we're going to do with them and how. So, should you just give them to people who don't have a problem, or don't see that they have a problem?
And we know from a lot of imaging, healthy adults will have things like amyloid in their brains, and they're fine.
Definitely. People can have amyloid for many, many years. So we have to think very carefully about when to use. Right now, the blood biomarkers are pretty much used in research. We use them a lot. They're much, the other ways of measuring amyloid and tau, let's say, in the brain are the imaging approaches are very expensive. But, should we now talk about people at a certain age just starting to get those assays? I don't think so. I don't think we're ready for that. I think, once someone starts to have a problem, I think then it's good to know what it is. But it's an ethical problem, but it's also just a realistic problem of what exactly do these pathologies mean in people who have no other sign of a problem.
Yeah.
I think if we really knew how to cure the disease,
could be a different story.
It would be
there.
different.
Yeah.
We have the earliest sign, boom, let's go.
Yeah.
But right now, I think it's and people are still working it out. And the definition of Alzheimer's disease is changing. So we always defined Alzheimer's disease based on cognition and function. And people rightly said, well, that's not really how you define a disease. You define a disease by the underlying problem, amyloid and tau, let's say. So people want to move to that definition. I think the problem is, first of all, it's not a full definition, really, for Alzheimer's disease. There's a lot more going on. But also, is it right to tell someone they have Alzheimer's disease if they're cognitively normal, they have amyloid and tau based on a blood marker with no idea of when they're going to start to have a real problem.
Right.
So there's a lot to work out here.
Right, yeah.
Also, like you were saying earlier, the early symptoms can be so different in different people. So by the time people become symptomatic, because usually I would think that in Alzheimer's, it'd be something that would be based on self-report or report of your loved ones. And so
Yeah.
Since there's such variety in the types of symptoms people get in the beginnings, whether it's memory or sleep issues or whatever it might be, by the time they reach a point of being symptomatic enough to seek help,
Yeah.
it would be quite far along in the progression of the
Well,
disease.
you'd be surprised. It's, clinically, I'm a clinical neuropsychologist also. I don't do it anymore, but I tested people for many years, and within my division, we also have a clinical section. And it's really a range. You'll have people and maybe their families who, by the time they say, we think something's really wrong, these people are really quite demented. And others are really very sensitive. He used to do this very well, and I see it's not happening.
Right.
Yeah. And I think anybody in the business watches themselves very carefully.
Yeah.
We that are a little older than you guys.
So what kind of tasks tend to show decline first? Is there any kind of typical progression?
It really depends on what people do, right? It could be a memory thing. Word finding is a common, there's a whole set of very common first steps in the Alzheimer's disease, but it's always very subtle. It's always very subtle. And, part of what the neurologist does and the neuropsychologist has to do is there's a lot of other things that can cause those same problems. So they have to work that part out.
Yeah, things like, I think we had a talk recently on how individuals who are in the early stages of Alzheimer's will show difficulty in managing finances. So loved ones will start noticing there are a lot of money issues going on. So that's also one aspect that can affect individuals.
That's a sad way that it happens. But a lot of elderly people have money stolen from them with all of these,
scams.
Scams, We have a friend does not have Alzheimer's disease, but these scams can get very complex.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, so it could be that, remembering names, word finding. There's a whole set of things that are common, but they are also part of normal aging as well.
I was going to say I have a problem with word finding.
Yeah. People will usually tell us like, oh, we have concerns because we walk into rooms and forget why we're there. I'm like, I have that same issue. Yeah.
We all do.
Can't find my words.
I think also older people, because everyone is aware of this, are more sensitive to it than younger people.
Right.
But, just normal cognitive aging is real. Leaving out amyloid, leaving out tau, like in the study that I have, we have, as I mentioned before, if people 20 through 80, we follow them every 5 years. The people from 20 to 25 show cognitive declines on average. Not everybody. Some get better, some get worse. But on average, all these things are happening over time.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and on the other side, we're learning new skills, learning different levels of thinking.
Yes.
So it's an interesting. That's why we like to study it.
Right.
Yeah.
So what about things like depression, anxiety, or chronic stress? How do these interact with reserve and things like brain maintenance?
So there's two ways to answer that. The cognitive reserve concept has, I started using it to look at cognitive aging and Alzheimer's, but it's been applied to many other diseases and many other syndromes. So, there's different kinds of depression too, but certainly one could think about cognitive reserve in depression, and people have looked at it in schizophrenia too. But each one we really have to wrestle with. Okay, the way I try to think about it. Okay, what is causing the cognitive problem? What is the process underlying the cognitive problem? And then sort of the rate of that decline, and then are there things that moderate the impact? And if you can find those kinds of exposures that moderate the impact, you're sort of in the cognitive reserve domain.
Right.
Yeah.
So talking about the exposures, you're currently running a longitudinal study called the RANN study, which is the Reference Ability Neural Network, is I think what RANN stands for.
Yeah.
So could you tell us what exactly you're looking at in this study, what you're examining?
So the RANN study was designed more to look at cognitive aging. It started out because this guy Salthouse, who very, very prominent person in cognitive aging, did a few papers where he said that I could take most of cognitive aging and put it into 4 domains: memory, reasoning, processing speed, and vocabulary. Mm-hmm. And he felt that once he covered those, it really covered most of the changes that occur in aging. A lot of people would add in executive function, but Tim doesn't believe in executive function. He thinks it's partly speed and reasoning is really executive function. Okay. So I was very taken by this, and I thought, well, if we use fMRI and image people, and we give them these 4 different types of tasks, we could probably get very specific patterns of brain activation, of brain utilization that are associated with these 4 abilities. So we put out a grant where we said, okay, we're going to give 3 tasks from each of these 4 abilities, and we're going to try to understand if we can get specific readouts from the brain for each of those cognitive abilities. And that's why it's called a reference ability, because Tim called those the reference abilities. But what it's turned into, and we've done that. We published a bunch of papers like that. But really, it's a very nice study of aging, because as we've said a few times, we've started at 20. We're seeing people every 5 years, and we see change gradually occurring across our people. And besides just looking for these sort of RANs, a specific type of activation for each of those 4 activities, we can look at a lot of brain-related measures, a lot more in depth, and watch them over time. So we have fMRI. Again, we talked about this before. We have resting bull, but we also have all the measures of brain change, and we have the blood-based biomarkers, and anything else that people start to think is interesting. So it's a nice way for us to understand just brain aging over time and cognitive change over time. It's the reserve part sort of sits on top of that at this point, because we give some special tasks in the scanner that we're interested in for people with reserve. But it's a way of looking at aging. Now there are some huge studies out there with really large numbers of people, like the British birth cohort comes to mind, or others. So one has to ask, what am I doing? Yeah. Or if you don't ask, the reviewers of your grants will ask, what am I doing with my data set that people couldn't just go to that? Yeah. So, our thoughts about that are the level of imaging that we have, especially we have 12 tasks in the scanner that they do. Plus a lot of measures like the energetics and other things that we were talking about that make it unique. So that's that study. Okay. It sits sort of, and as I said, the cognitive reserve sits on top of that. Yeah.
Super cool. Are there everyday activities people can do to strengthen their cognitive reserve? Is that something that we can manipulate?
I think so. I'm sort of someone who follows my research. So like we did this is a real New York City analysis. We looked at stair climbing because in New York we have the subways and people drive less, and we were able to show that really acted like cognitive reserve or physical, more generally physical exercise. So I think what it comes down to is most of the things that your mother told you are good for you. She was right. Exercising, good diet, social networks, trying to be active cognitively. People who are in school, it's one thing, but people who are out of work, finished with their working age, they, those are all of the things that, and there's a lot of other things that have been like meditation, Tai Chi,
sleep as well.
Sleep, very much so. So I think these are all things that everyone has to think about. Another one is if you have hearing problems, making sure you have a hearing aid.
Right, that's a big one.
And what journal every couple of years has sort of a summary of those. Lancet.
Right,
Lancet has a summary every couple of years. But these are all important, and I think they make a difference. I think the issue is that. And I think they'll allow people to do better in the face of Alzheimer's pathology. But I think we have to be very clear that just because you do all of those things doesn't mean you won't get Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah, there are much bigger factors at play.
Yes.
Genetics,
age. The pathology is a bad pathology, and if you have it, it's but it will allow people to cope longer.
I guess it's building that reserve.
And we're talking about pure cognitive aging. It doesn't. These things we're talking about are not just good for Alzheimer's disease; they're good for cognitive aging also. We have even looked at variables like those that are involved with brain maintenance. Right? So we talked about that concept of brain maintenance before. That's maintaining your brain, and some of these same exposures are involved with maintaining the brain as well. So that's already a very good thing for normal aging.
Yeah, I mean, I understand that. I guess when you get to a certain age, you want to maintain what you have. But is it ever too late to start building cognitive reserve? Is it something you have to do when you're younger, or can you start when you're older?
I think that the data shows that there are exposures at every age that make a difference. So just because someone didn't have a great education or an interesting occupation or whatever, there's things that people can do in older age that will make a difference. It's a lifelong process.
Yeah, and I think you kind of touched on it for a bit, but when individuals retire and we see these like large cognitive declines happening after individuals are in retirement age, I can imagine how important it is to maintain these healthy activities. The diet is so important because I think a lot of these, if you stop, it's not necessarily that if you've been doing it for many years, it's protective. You have to keep on doing these activities.
Use it or lose it thing.
It's really very important. It's really very important. And it's sort of funny. I watched myself, like I was saying before. So we had a paper on stair climbing, so I started climbing the stairs to my office. We did a paper, we actually wrote a grant to look at Tai Chi, so I started doing Tai Chi.
I love that. Implementing.
So we try. And exercise, I was really never an exerciser, but now I really feel like it's very important.
Yeah, for sure.
So, and diet, all these things.
And just never stop. Keep doing them.
Because
even with education, we talk about that being like a proxy for cognitive reserve. But let's say somebody got a PhD and then after they graduate, they don't really do anything to maintain their cognition or challenge themselves. Is that education really protective after that if you stop maintaining all of this?
I think it might be to some degree, but I think it's better to just keep on. And I'm at the age where I have a lot of friends that are retired, and they have very busy schedules. Part of it is just because they're the kind of people that like that, but part of it is everyone feels, first of all, it's fun. It's nice, but also people understand that they have to remain active.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So is there any role for bilingualism in brain resilience? Because I've heard papers have come out talking about how it can be protective against some forms of cognitive decline. Do you think it has any actual role in resilience or reserve?
It's an interesting question. There's a lot of research, and there's people in my division that are very involved in research in bilingualism. It's a complicated problem. I think the very initial papers were not so convincing to me, but it really comes down to like everything else, it's complicated. What is bilingualism?
Right.
So like one of the people in my division is working in India, where I don't know, there's like 80 different languages.
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah.
Right, so all of a sudden bilingualism is a much more complex concept. It's a complex area. Lifelong bilingualism, or do you use both?
Yeah,
right.
When did you learn both languages?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so I think there's something to it, but I think it's really very, very complicated. But clearly, you want to learn how to speak French, I think it's good.
It's a good activity to do in later life.
Yeah, learning a language is always very
in terms of stimulating your brain and keeping active and going kind of out of your comfort zone a little bit.
For sure. So what are the biggest questions you're still trying to answer in your research?
That's a good question. I think with regards to cognitive reserve, I really feel like we have to understand the underlying brain mechanisms. So I feel like we have to look at it over time and really understand how it emerges over time and how things change over time. So that's a lot of where my grants are pointed. I think that as we were discussing earlier, there's more and more ways to characterize what's really happening in the brain at a level that I was not trained to do. Those kinds of approaches are really more current. Sometimes I summarize them as I did before as omics, metabolomics, but there's a lot of knowledge now. So you can take one blood sample and measure all of these different aspects of what's going on in the brain at a level that we just didn't have before.
Right.
So I think that's really going to make a difference, and that's something that's already happening.
Kind of really trying to understand those neural mechanisms behind this.
Yeah. So when I see neural mechanisms, I look at someone doing a task in a scanner. Right. But someone else is looking at a cascade of some chemical in the brain or in the body. It's just a different level.
Yeah.
There's things that can be done on the non-human side. So these same guidelines that we created with this framework for cognitive reserve in studies of humans, we made sure that they were designed so that people working with non-humans could do it too. So like an early paper that came out, we gave out awards for postdocs to do pilot studies. So someone was looking at cognitive reserve in mice and looking at differential expression of various genes in the brain. And certain ones were associated with cognition directly, but other genes were really associated with moderating the impact of brain change.
Yeah.
So that's a gene expression.
Right.
So I think given the sophistication of research now, there's a lot of levels to move it to.
Yeah, so kind of approaching it from these different levels of measurement.
Definitely. And I think in the end, my hope is that we'll move past just saying, okay, exercise. There might be more direct understanding of mechanisms.
Maybe what type of exercise,
Yeah,
how
a
much.
more individualized kind of approach,
Yeah,
right?
or
With all
more
this information you
individualized, or
have.
can we moderate? Can we
Yeah.
monitor it? I think we're in a good place with that.
I mean, but the whole cognitive reserve concept kind of speaks to the individual variability between people, right? And so
100%.
being able to measure that and then tailor solutions to people based on where they're at
Right.
or
So
how much reserve they have.
we have maybe 20 different measures of just lifestyle and education and other that we say we call it reserve-y. They're part of reserve. We have sets of brain networks that we've looked at that are associated with specific cognitive functions. But yeah, I think it opens up a very hopeful pathway.
Yeah. Sounds like an exciting time for sure.
Yeah.
Okay, that was a really interesting conversation, Dr. Yaakov Stern. Thank you so much for chatting with us today. We look forward to hearing more about your future research and learning more about cognitive reserve.
It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Neurologic, a CVL podcast. If you like what you're hearing, please follow and share with others. This podcast wouldn't be possible without the support of our team and the incredible work that goes on behind the scenes. We'd like to give special thanks to Patricia Moran for editing this episode. To learn more about the Center for Vital Longevity, just look up cvl.utdallas.edu, and here you'll find information about our research as well as information on how to volunteer to participate in our studies and how to donate to support innovative research to understand, protect, and enhance the vitality of the mind across the lifespan. Join us next time as we continue to explore the latest research and strategies for keeping our brains healthy throughout our lives.